In a city where everyone wears a mask, the most dangerous people are the ones you never notice at all. The Gilded Orchid wasn't just a dining room. It was a fortress disguised as indulgence. Here, high-ranking judges shared cognac with the very men they pretended to prosecute, and men like Ji-hoon, the architect, Park came to believe they had finally outrun the ghosts of Seoul. Ji-hoon sat in the velvet shadows of Booth 4, jaw carved from stone, trying to believe he was finally civilized. But across the room, Maya moved like water through stone. She didn't smile like the other waitresses. She possessed a stillness born from surviving the unthinkable, her eyes mapping exits with military precision. She was a ghost in a room full of monsters. At 8:42 p.m., the front door didn't open, it exploded. Suddenly, the invisible woman was the only thing standing between the tiger and the grave. If you're ready for a story about power, dignity, forbidden love, and the sweetest revenge you've ever witnessed, then you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because this channel brings you the most addictive romance stories you won't find anywhere else. Drop a fire in the comments if you're team revenge. And let's get into this story. The Gilded Orchid functioned on a singular, unspoken rule: the higher the price of the wine, the quieter the conversation. The air inside was heavy, a thick cocktail of expensive sandalwood, the sizzle of seared fat from the kitchen, and the unmistakable, metallic tang of unspoken power. It was a cathedral of the elite, a place where the architecture was designed to make men like Ji-hoon Park feel like gods who had successfully evolved past their predatory roots. Ji-hoon, known in the underworld as the architect, for the cold, structural precision of his hits, leaned back in his tailored charcoal suit. To the world of Forbes, those shoulders represented a tech visionary who had modernized the logistics of the Pacific Rim. But tonight, in the flickering amber light, he felt the old ghost of Bisusen stirring beneath his skin. He looked at his hands, manicured clean, adorned with a Patek Philippe that cost more than a suburban home, and saw only the phantom stains of the docks where he'd earned his first million in blood. He was the tiger, an apex predator currently pacing a cage of his own making, desperately trying to find the civilization he had spent 40 years buying. He was a man who knew that in his world, peace was just the silence between gunshots. But while Ji-hoon was trying to forget who he was, Maya was defined by her ability to remain forgotten. She moved through the dining room with a grace that was entirely too efficient for a waitress. Most staff in a place like this were trained to be invisible through subservience. Maya was invisible through perfection. She didn't just carry a tray, she balanced it as if it were an extension of her own center of gravity. She didn't just pour wine, she monitored the room's peripheral boundaries with a gaze that never settled but always recorded. Ji-hoon watched her. He told himself it was curiosity, but it was actually recognition. He saw the way her eyes never lingered on a guest's face, but always on their hands, checking for a tell, a twitch, a hidden weapon. He saw the way she stood near the load-bearing pillars, never in the center of the open floor where a person is most vulnerable. She was a woman forged somewhere far darker than a hospitality program. While Ji-hoon was a monster pretending to be a man, Maya was a weapon pretending to be a tool. She was a black woman in a room full of people who didn't see her as a person, and she used that invisibility like a cloak of shadows. The atmosphere was a curated symphony of high society chatter and the clink of crystal. A jazz trio played in the corner, the bass notes vibrating through the floorboards, creating a sense of rhythm and safety. It was the sound of a world that believed violence was something that only happened on the evening news, in zip codes far removed from the Gilded Orchid. Then, the hum died. It wasn't a scream that broke the spell. It was the sound of a vehicle, something heavy, diesel-tuned, and fast, jumping the curb outside. For a heartbeat, the room hung in a vacuum of confusion. Ji-hoon's fork stayed suspended halfway to his mouth. Maya, standing near the vintage wine cellar, went perfectly still. Her chin dropped an inch. Her weight shifted to the balls of her feet. In that microsecond, she wasn't a waitress anymore. She was a ghost reaching for a haunting. The massive mahogany doors, symbols of security and status, didn't just open, they were breached. The sound was a physical blow, a concussive roar that sent the jazz music into a discordant silence. 5 men poured into the room. They moved in a staggered diamond formation, a tactical maneuver designed to provide 360-degree coverage in an instant. They weren't wearing the cheap hoodies of street thugs. They were draped in matte black tactical nylon, ballistic masks obscuring their faces, and submachine guns held in high-ready positions. They were military-grade operatives executing a wet work contract. As the lead operative's visor locked onto Booth 4, the architect felt a cold electricity surge through his veins. The mask of the businessman shattered. But as he prepared to lunge, he caught a glimpse of the waitress. She hadn't dived for cover. She was standing behind the heavy oak service station, her eyes cold, her hand reaching not for a phone, but for a heavy, silver-plated carving knife. The air in the Gilded Orchid didn't just turn cold, it turned electric. In the vacuum left by the crashing doors, there was a single heartbeat of pure, crystalline terror. Then, the lead operative's weapon began to level toward Ji-hoon's chest. Ji-hoon didn't wait for the trigger pull. The tiger didn't survive the docks by being second. He exploded from his chair in a blur of charcoal wool. His movement was liquid, a predatory surge that defied his expensive tailoring. Before the lead gunman could compensate, Ji-hoon was inside his guard. He gripped the man's forearm, twisting with the mechanical indifference of a vice. The sound of the radius snapping was as sharp as a dry branch breaking in winter. Ji-hoon didn't stop. He drove a palm strike into the man's throat, collapsing the windpipe, and used the falling body as a human shield against the second operative. Bullets chewed into the heavy mahogany table and the dying operative, but Ji-hoon was already moving. He was a master of surgical violence. He didn't waste energy on wide swings. He targeted the architecture of the human body. He stepped into the second man's personal space, his fingers finding the nerve clusters beneath the jaw. With a sickeningly precise jerk, the operative's head snapped back, his nervous system short-circuiting as Ji-hoon drove a knee into his liver. The third attacker, seeing his teammates neutralized in seconds, swung his submachine gun in a wide arc, his finger tightening on the trigger. Ji-hoon dived, rolling over the debris of a shattered bottle of wine. He came up with a shard of thick glass in his right hand. As the operative turned, Ji-hoon lunged, driving the shard into the soft tissue of the man's thigh, severing the femoral artery. The man collapsed, not with a scream, but with a frantic, wet gasp of disbelief. But even a tiger can be overwhelmed. The remaining 2 operatives were professionals. They didn't panic. They split. One moved left, using a knocked-over buffet for cover, while the other circled right. They created a kill zone, a crossfire that Ji-hoon, caught in the open between the tables, couldn't dodge. Ji-hoon looked at the barrel of the 4th man's weapon. He felt the cold breath of the grave. He prepared to die as he had lived, teeth bared, fighting alone. Then, the ghost intervened. Maya didn't scream. She didn't hesitate. She moved with a frightening, silent velocity that made Ji-hoon's own violence look clumsy. From behind the service station, she launched the heavy, silver-plated serving tray. It didn't just fly, it hummed through the air like a circular saw. It caught the 4th gunman squarely in the temple, his head snapping sideways as his helmet cracked from the sheer kinetic force. Before the 5th man could register the new threat, Maya was on him. She didn't have a gun. She had the tools of a waitress, transformed by a lethal imagination. In her left hand was a heavy bottle of unopened champagne, in her right, the silver carving knife. The operative tried to swing his rifle, but Maya was too close. She slammed the base of the bottle into his collarbone, the heavy glass shattering on impact, but not before the bone beneath it gave way. As the man stumbled, Maya didn't give him an inch. She grabbed the barrel of his rifle with one hand, redirecting the muzzle toward the floor, and with a terrifyingly calm precision, she drove the knife into the gap between his tactical vest and his neck. She didn't twist. She didn't struggle. She simply applied pressure to a specific point she clearly knew by heart. The man's eyes went wide, his hands falling limp as his brain lost contact with his limbs. Maya let him fall. She stood over the heap of black nylon and tactical gear, her breathing shallow but controlled. Her apron was splattered with a dark, expensive-looking red that wasn't wine. Her posture had shifted from the deferential tilt of a server to the coiled, predatory stance of an elite operator. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against the eardrums. The smoke from the flashbangs drifted through the amber light, curling around the wreckage of the fortress. The elite socialites were hiding under white linen tablecloths. There were only two people left standing in the center of the room, the tiger and the ghost. Ji-hoon looked at the bodies. Then he looked at the woman who had just saved his life with a serving tray and a bottle of bubbly. He saw the 1,000-yard stare of someone who had seen the end of the world and decided to keep walking. He realized that the woman refilling his water for the last 6 months wasn't a waitress. She was his equal. "The government doesn't train waitresses to move like that," Ji-hoon said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Maya didn't answer. She began to untie her apron, her movements methodical, as if she were simply finishing a shift. Ji-hoon stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "Who are you?" he demanded. 48 hours is a lifetime in the underworld. It is enough time for the high-gloss marble of the gilded orchid to be scrubbed of blood, for the broken glass to be replaced, and for a man like Ji-hoon Park to realize that his fortress of indulgence was nothing more than a glass cage. The city outside was gray, a relentless drizzle blurring the neon signs of Koreatown into smears of electric blue and red. Ji-hoon didn't go to his office. He didn't call his lawyers. Instead, he drove himself to a corner of the city where the streetlights had been shot out, and the only sound was the low hum of industrial air conditioners. The dive bar was called the Void, a fitting name for a place where people went to disappear. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale hops, cheap disinfectant, and the quiet, heavy desperation of patrons who lived their lives in the margins. He spotted her immediately. Maya wasn't wearing the pristine white apron of a waitress. She sat at the far end of the scarred wooden bar, her hood pulled up, a glass of water untouched in front of her. She didn't look up when he entered, but he saw her shoulders shift, a minute adjustment of weight that told him she had already clocked his entrance, his gait, and the fact that he was unarmed. "I wasn't hiding from you, Ji-hoon," she said, her voice a low vibration that barely carried over the static of a nearby television. "I was hiding from the noise. You're a loud man. You moved through this city like a landslide, leaving a trail of broken glass and expensive lawsuits. I prefer the silence. Silence is a luxury neither of us can afford anymore," Ji-hoon replied, sliding onto the stool beside her. He didn't order a drink. He reached into his overcoat and pulled out a stack of high-resolution surveillance photographs. He slid them across the bar. Maya looked down. The images were grainy, shot from a distance with a telephoto lens. They showed her leaving her apartment. They showed her walking to this very bar. In every frame, a black SUV with tinted windows was visible 2 blocks behind her. In one shot, a man in a nondescript gray jacket was leaning against a lamp post, his eyes fixed on her back. "The Los Reyes cartel," Ji-hoon whispered. "They lost 5 of their best wetwork operatives in my restaurant. They don't care about the territory anymore. They care about the fact that an invisible woman made them look like amateurs. You're a loose end, Maya. And in their world, loose ends are tied with piano wire." Maya felt a cold needle of adrenaline prick her skin. For 3 years, she had meticulously built a life of nothingness. She had learned to dim her own light, to speak softly, to be the person people looked at but never truly saw. Now, that safety was gone. The world had reached out and grabbed her by the throat. "Why are you here, Ji-hoon? You could have sent a tactical team to watch my apartment. You could have let them take me to keep the heat off your own operations. Why risk coming here yourself?" Ji-hoon finally turned to face her. In the dim, flickering light of the bar, the architect looked weary. The mask of the billionaire was gone, replaced by the jagged edges of the man who had survived the docks of Bususan. "Because for the first time in 20 years I saw someone who looks at the floor and sees a tactical map instead of carpet. You don't see guests, you see assets and threats. You're a monster pretending to be a woman, just like I'm a monster pretending to be a man. I realize that if I'm going to survive what's coming, I need the only other person in this city who speaks my language. He leaned in closer, his shadow swallowing her. They've compromised my inner circle. The attack at the Gilded Orchid wasn't just a hit, it was an invitation. I need a partner who doesn't exist on any payroll. I need a ghost who knows how to kill. Help me find the leak, help me burn the Los Reyes operation to the ground, and I will give you what you actually want. And what's that? A real disappearance, Ji-hoon said. New identity. Untraceable accounts in Zurich. A life where you don't have to look over your shoulder every time a car jumps a curb. I'll buy your freedom, Maya. But first, you have to help me earn mine. Maya looked at the photos again. She recognized the man in the gray jacket. She recognized the way he balanced his weight, the stillness of a professional killer. He was already here. She glanced at the dark window of the bar and saw a flicker of a reflection that shouldn't have been there. The surveillance anxiety became a physical pressure. The walls were closing in. I have conditions, Maya said, her voice dropping into that lethal, military cadence. I'm not your employee. I'm not your bodyguard. I'm your partner. We share the intel. We share the risk. And if I think you're leading me into a trap, I'll end you before they do. Ji-hoon didn't flinch. He smiled, the smile of a man who had finally found someone he could trust, precisely because she was dangerous enough to kill him. Equal say. Equal risk. The penthouse was a cathedral of glass and steel, suspended 30 stories above a city that looked like a circuit board of flickering sins. Inside, the air was filtered, chilled, and silent. It was a place designed to make the occupant feel like they had ascended beyond the reach of the world's grime. But as Ji-hoon and Maya stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the reflection of the city lights made them look like ghosts trapped in a high-tech cage. This isn't a home, Maya said, her voice echoing off the minimalist marble walls. It's a bunker with a view. In my world, there is no difference, Ji-hoon replied. He had shed his overcoat, revealing the holster strapped to his ribs, a jarring contrast to his silk shirt. He poured 2 glasses of neat bourbon, the ice clinking like a countdown. You only build walls this high when you know exactly what's coming for you. He handed her a glass. She took it, but her eyes never left the perimeter of the room. This was the moment of the backstory leak, the point where the mystery of the ghost begins to solidify into something human, and therefore, more tragic. I grew up in a place where the walls were made of corrugated tin, Ji-hoon continued, his voice dropping into the rasp of the boy he used to be. I watched my father, a man who thought honesty was a shield, get dismantled by gangs because he couldn't pay for the air he breathed. I promised myself I would become more dangerous than anything that could threaten me. I thought that was freedom. But look at us. 2 apex predators hiding in a glass box. Maya turned, the light from the city carving deep shadows across her face. I didn't choose to be dangerous, she said softly. The government chose for me. They took a girl from a neighborhood they'd already given up on and they turned her into a scalpel. I was part of a unit they didn't put on the books. We were the people they sent when they wanted a problem to disappear without a sound. No names. No records. Just results. She looked at her hands, the same hands that had driven a carving knife into a man's throat. But knives get dull, Ji-hoon. Or they get too sharp for the people holding them. 3 years ago, my unit was retired. I was the only one who saw the retirement coming. I buried my name, and I thought I could bury the hunger for the hunt. I thought if I served enough wine and smiled enough fake smiles, I could become someone who didn't know how to kill. And now? Now the tiger is at the door, and I realize I never stopped being a blade. I just stopped being used by them. The vulnerability in the room was palpable, a rare, emotional spike, where 2 damaged souls recognize their own reflections. But in this storytelling formula, peace is always the harbinger of a storm. The silence was shattered not by a sound, but by a smell. Maya's nostrils flared. Smoke, she whispered. Ji-hoon turned toward his monitors. The security feed for the Gilded Orchid, his crown jewel, was a wall of static. Then, one camera flickered to life. The restaurant was an inferno. The amber light he loved had been replaced by the roaring, hungry orange of gasoline-fed flames. Through the thick black smoke, he saw the shapes of bodies, his staff, people who had nothing to do with the wars of kings, lying among the melted silverware. The camera panned, seemingly guided by an invisible hand, until it focused on the far wall. Through the heat distortion, the words were visible, scrawled in thick, industrial paint. "Tigers bleed too." Ji-hoon's glass shattered in his hand. He didn't flinch as the bourbon and blood dripped onto the white marble floor. His face didn't twist in rage. It went perfectly, terrifyingly still. "They didn't just hit a business," Maya said, her voice cold as steel. "They hit your pride. Paulo Reyes isn't trying to win a market anymore. He's trying to break a god." "He succeeded," Ji-hoon whispered. "He broke the man who wanted to be civilized. All that's left now is the tiger." The hunt for a traitor is never a loud affair. It is a quiet, surgical removal of a cancer you didn't know you had. In the wake of the Gilded Orchid's destruction, the penthouse didn't feel like a sanctuary anymore. It felt like an interrogation room, cold and clinical. The smell of smoke from the restaurant attack seemed to cling to Ji-hoon's clothes, a reminder that his civilization was nothing more than ash. Daniel sat by the glowing monitors, his face illuminated by the flickering data streams Maya was pulling from the deep web and the encrypted internal servers of his own company. This was the controlled reveal, the slow peeling back of layers that the channel uses to keep the audience locked in. Maya's fingers danced across the keys with a rhythm that suggested she had dismantled entire government networks before. "You don't look for a traitor in the shadows, Ji-hoon," Maya said, her voice a low vibration that seemed to cut through the hum of the air conditioning. "You look for them in the light. You look for the person who has the most to lose if you actually succeed in becoming the man you pretend to be. A tiger who stops hunting is useless to those who live off his kills." She bypassed the triple-layer firewalls of Ji-hoon's personal security. A list of names appeared: board members, long-term associates, bodyguards. Then, the anomaly. A series of encrypted pings coming from a localized device within the building, sent moments before the Gilded Orchid attack, and again moments before the arson. The source wasn't an external hacker. It wasn't the Los Reyes cartel. It was Minjun. The silence that followed was heavier than the sound of the gunshots that had started this war. Minjun wasn't just Ji-hoon's head of security. He was the man who had stood by him on the docks of Bisusun when they were both starving children. He was the one who had carried Ji-hoon through the rain when a rival gang had left him for dead 15 years ago. "Why?" Ji-hoon whispered. The word sounded like it was being dragged over broken glass. "Because of the brother you don't talk about," Maya said softly, pulling up a redacted, 30-year-old police file from a precinct in Seoul. "Hwan. He was collateral damage in your final play for power. You won the city, Ji-hoon. You became the architect. But Minjun lost the only person he ever loved because of a decision you made for the greater good. He didn't want your money, and he didn't want your empire. He wanted to watch you build a world of glass just so he could be the one to shatter it. He wanted you to feel what it's like when the floor disappears." This was the emotional strategy of the formula, making the villain's motive sympathetic, turning a simple revenge plot into a Greek tragedy. Ji-hoon didn't explode in rage. He simply looked at the tactical handgun on the marble table. "He's at the construction site," Ji-hoon said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "The new skyscraper at Wilshire. He knows that's where my sister is overseeing the final floor. He's not finishing the job. He's finishing me." They moved as a single unit. The construction site was a skeleton of steel and shadows, 30 floors above the city, swaying slightly in the midnight wind. As they ascended in the open-air service elevator, the city below looked like a sea of diamonds. Ji-hoon turned to Maya. This was the emotional peak, the point where the monster and the ghost finally admit their bond. "If this goes wrong," Ji-hoon said, the wind whipping his hair, "go. Don't look back. You've spent 3 years trying to be a ghost. Don't die for a man who's already a corpse. Maya looked at him, and for the first time, she reached out and squeezed his hand. Her grip was like iron. I told you, Ji-hoon. Equal say. Equal risk. I'm not running from the fire anymore. I'm the one who started it. The elevator lurched to a halt on the 30th floor. The scene was framed like a cinematic nightmare. Minjun stood at the edge of the floor, holding a silenced pistol to the head of Ji-hoon's sister. Around them stood the remnants of the Los Reyes hit squad. You always were a visionary, architect, Minjun called out. But you forgot that visions are built on graves. I didn't want to kill you in that restaurant. I wanted you to see everything you loved burn first. I wanted you to feel the weight of the air when you have no one left to share it with. Ji-hoon stepped forward, hands empty, exposing his heart. Then take me, Minjun. Let her go. Let the girl go, and you can do whatever you want with the tiger. Minjun's finger tightened on the trigger. The psychological tension was a physical cord stretched to the point of snapping. The wind on the 30th floor didn't just howl, it screamed, a high-pitched whistle through the skeletal steel. Minjun's hand didn't shake, but his eyes did, flickering with a decade of grief that no amount of blood could ever truly wash away. The ghost doesn't miss, Minjun, Ji-hoon said, his voice steady even as the red laser dot remained fixed on his old friend's heart. Maya emerged from the shadows behind a concrete pillar. She didn't have the carving knife now. She held a tactical sidearm she had liberated from a guard downstairs. Her stance was perfect, her breathing synchronized with the wind. She wasn't a waitress, she wasn't even a ghost anymore. She was the inevitability of a past that Ji-hoon and Minjun had both tried to outrun. Drop the gun, Minjun, Maya commanded. It wasn't an emotional plea. It was a professional assessment. The girl hasn't done anything to you. If you pull that trigger, you die before she hits the ground. Is that the legacy you want for Hwan? Another death in a cycle that never ends? You've spent 15 years being a shadow. Look at the light for once. Minjun looked at Ji-hoon, then at the girl, then at the city below, a sea of light that cared nothing for the men who bled to build it. The escalating stakes had reached their breaking point. For a heartbeat, the world hung in the balance. Then, Minjun lowered the weapon. He didn't surrender to the law. He surrendered to the exhaustion of his own rage. You won, architect, he whispered, the wind nearly swallowing his words. You always were the tiger. But look around. You're standing on a mountain of glass, and you're still alone. Not anymore, Ji-hoon said, looking toward Maya. The resolution of the conflict wasn't a hail of bullets, but a controlled reveal of character growth. Ji-hoon didn't call the police. He didn't call his fixers. He walked to his sister, shielded her, and then looked at Minjun, the man who had been his brother in everything but blood. Go, Ji-hoon said. The Los Reyes cartel is dismantled. Their leadership is burning. Take what's left of your life and find a place where Hwan's name doesn't sound like a curse. If I ever see you again, I won't be the man who remembers the docks. I'll be the tiger. Minjun vanished into the stairwell, a shadow returning to the dark. As the sun began to bleed over the Los Angeles horizon, turning the sky the color of a bruised peach, Ji-hoon and Maya stood at the edge of the floor. The contrast between calm and chaos was absolute. Below them, the city was waking up, unaware of the war that had been fought in its clouds. What now? Maya asked, her voice returning to that quiet, steady tone she'd used when she was just a waitress at the Gilded Orchid. The restaurant is gone, Ji-hoon said, looking at the smoke still rising from the distance. The fortress is a ruin. I think it's time I stopped pretending to be civilized. And the ghost? Ji-hoon turned to her. He reached out and touched her face, his fingers grazing the skin of a woman who had saved him twice over. The ghost stays. Not as an employee. Not as a shadow. As the only truth I have left. They descended the skeleton of the building and walked toward the armored sedan waiting at the curb. They didn't look like heroes. They looked like two people who had looked into the abyss and realized they liked the view. They drove into the morning light, leaving the wreckage behind. The narrator attitude here shifts to the philosophical. The tiger and the ghost were no longer running from their natures. They were running toward them. In a city built on masks and lies, they had finally found the only thing that mattered, a partner brave enough to bleed beside them. Thank you for staying until the end. That means more than you think. If this story of the architect and the void touched something inside you, if you felt the tension and the truth in Maya's journey, please subscribe and join our storytelling family. Like this video and tell me in the comments, do you think Ji-hoon was right to let Minjun go? I read every single one of your thoughts because this isn't just a channel, it's a connection. Don't wander too far. The next story is already waiting in the dark.